Oh, you're back. Sorry. Let me get this out of the way. So, thanks for coming back. I'm Professor John Blakeman from the UW-Stevens Point Political Science Department, and this is my ongoing lecture series on the U.S. Constitution, sponsored by the UWSP Alumni Association and their Alumni College Experience. So this is lecture number 2, and here I'll just give you a very basic rundown on the Constitution and how it's organized and some of the very important powers that the federal government has in the Constitution. It's what I call a roadmap to the Constitution. And hopefully it will help you understand a little better some of the basic principles embedded in our document, and maybe how those principles and powers sort of relate to each other. So let's get underway. Start with the Constitution and its outline, essentially. And so at the very beginning, we have the preamble. And a lot of us, remember, had to memorize that preamble when we were back in grade school, we the people. After the preamble, we have Article 1. Article 1, I'll talk about these in more detail in a few minutes. Article 1 concerns the powers of Congress. Article 2 concerns the powers of the executive. Article 3 focuses on the judiciary. Article 4 concerns the states. Article 5 is the amendment process. We won't deal a lot with that today. And then Article 6 at the very end contains what we call the Supremacy Clause. And then we have all of the amendments to the Constitution, all 27 of them, which we're not really going to focus on in this class, except for the First Amendment. So let's look at the preamble for a second. And, you know, the preamble to a constitution is basically a general statement of purpose. And the preamble to the United States Constitution has a lot of powerful words to it. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, blessings of liberty, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Now, interestingly, you know, if you think about your constitutional history, you'll recall that the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia during a very hot summer in 1788, very hot and humid. And after the Constitution was approved by the convention, it went out to the states for ratification. One of the very last things the delegates to the Constitutional Convention did was they wrote the preamble. And I don't want to say it was really an afterthought, but if you read the notes of the convention took by James Madison, then it does become clear that the delegates to the convention by early September started thinking, oh, wait, we need some kind of introductory statement. And this is what they came up with. And I always like to point out to my students that, you know, we the people means we the people. But the second clause here, in order to form a more perfect union, you know, I point out to my students that this Constitution is really our second national Constitution. The first one we had, 1783 onwards, was the Articles of Confederation, which really didn't work out too well. Now, I'm not going to get into that so much, but I'd encourage you to look into that a little more if you're wondering where some of the ideas about this specific Constitution came from. Now here, it's always good to compare, I think, and this is the preamble to the German Constitution, 1949, after World War II. Back then, it was called the German Basic Law. It still is, but the Germans also referred to it as their essential constitution. A little different than ours, based on Germany's experience, but the German people, conscious of their responsibility before God and men, animated by the resolve to preserve their national and political unity and to serve the peace of the world as an equal partner in a united Europe. Preambles definitely mean something, and they give you a good sense of what a constitution and what a people drafting that constitution think about it. All right, let's look at Article 1. Article 1 sets up Congress, our legislature. It tells us how the House and the Senate are to be constituted. The things that I really focus on in this class, Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8 is a fairly detailed list of the things that Congress can do. Article 1, Section 9 is a list of the things Congress cannot do. And together, Section 8 and Section 9, these two articles sort of round out congressional power. Article 1, Section 10 places limits on state power. And we're not going to get into this so much in this lecture series, but Article 1, Section 10, we call it a vertical federalism, sort of top to bottom in a sense. And remember, federalism is the division of power between the national government and the states. So Article 1, Section 10 limits the state's ability to influence national power. You know, and the thinking here by the framers of the Constitution is simply that there are some things the national government must do. There are some things that the states must do. And then the sense of vertical federalism, states and the national government are separate. They also have to work with each other, obviously, cooperate with each other, what we call cooperative federalism, but they are separate. And the Constitution limits the ability of states to influence or limit certain aspects of national policy. Okay, Article 2, the executive branch. People read Article 2 and they think, wow, there's not a lot of detail there. No, there's not. Article 2 tells us what the qualifications to become president are. You all know that, I think. The Electoral College, how we elect the president. We're not going to focus on that, unfortunately, but it's a big issue. Article 2, Section 2. This is the clause that gives the president, the executive, the chief executive, the commander-in-chief power, the power to negotiate treaties, the power to appoint government ministers. And then Article 2, Section 3, this is the constitutional requirement that the president from time to time notify Congress of the State of the Union. And it also has what we call the Take Care Clause, which is a very important presidential power, that the president take care to execute the laws of the United States. Article 3, the Judiciary. Again, people read Article 3 and think, oh, not a lot of detail there either. That's certainly true. Article 3 says we have to have one Supreme Court and one Chief Justice of the United States. Everything else is created by Congress. So Congress has the authority to create all federal courts in the system. It has the authority to create federal judgeships. It has the authority to specify there will be 8 associate justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. We have to have one Chief Justice of the United States, bringing us up to 9. But Congress has that power. Now, Article 3, Section 2, the jurisdiction or the power of federal courts is fairly detailed in the Constitution. And there's a lot of constitutional cases that deal with Article 3, Section 2. We deal with those in the class on campus. We're not going to deal with those in this lecture series. But according to the Constitution, federal courts have jurisdiction or power over cases concerning the U.S. Constitution. That makes sense. U.S. law, statutes passed by Congress, for example. International law, and cases between states where one state sues another state, and cases in which the United States is a party to the litigation. There are a few other aspects of jurisdiction as well that we don't need to go into, but are still important. So I'm just sort of giving you a broad nutshell here. So Article 4, limits on state power. Article 4, Section 2, the full faith and credit clause. Article 4, Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit clause. Article 4, Section 2, the privileges and immunities clause. Both of these together mean that states must recognize the laws and privileges given by other states to their own citizens. What we call horizontal federalism, that states must in general recognize the legal proceedings and citizenship requirements of other states. A lot of constitutional cases concerning both of those things. Now, and again, we're not dealing with those in this lecture series. But you should look at Article 4 as how the Constitution sort of conditions state power, especially as it relates from one state to another. We have the Article 5 amendment process, which I don't really want to get into right now. And then we have Article 6, which among other things contains Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause is quite clear that the Constitution and all laws passed by Congress are the supreme law of the land. Then we have the 27 amendments, which that's a whole separate course in and of itself. So think of this as a roadmap to the Constitution, just a very broad, basic outline. And we will move on to lecture number 3.